Ciao a tutti, good evening. Welcome to Monte Carlo.
So we've just had a technical presentation in which some very intelligent men from Ducati talked to some slightly less intelligent men from the press. And they've given us all the technical lowdown on the 2017 Monster 1200. Now it's a bit of an eye-opener really, because to look at, it doesn't look massively different from the existing Monster 1200, which is a bike we've had around since 2014. However, it turns out, if you go from the front to the back, pretty much every major part has been upgraded or improved, or simply replaced altogether. The front, the headlight now has some little LED daytime running lights. It's a completely new unit to the previous one. In the middle of the bike, the tank is slimmer and makes it give a slightly more compact feel. And at the back of the bike, even the tail has been shortened and thinned out as well. And it's not just an optical illusion, the whole bike really actually is a whole inch shorter. That's thanks to the new swing arm at the back of the bike. And that reduced wheelbase should make it feel a bit more sporty to ride. And of course they've not forgotten the noisy bit in the middle of the bike either. That's still the 1198cc 90-degree V-twin that we know from the previous bike, as well as the Multistrada and the Diavo before that. And they've teased a little bit more power out of it. It's now up to 150 horsepower from the previous bike's 135, 10 more on the S, but now both bikes get that full 150 horsepower. And just to put that into context, the very first Monster, the 1993 Monster 900, made just 75, so we're talking about a bike with twice as much power as the original. To go with the superbike levels of performance we've now got from the Monster, there's now superbike standard of electronics. The previous Monster already had traction control and ABS and rider modes. This new bike has all of those, but made even better. And in addition to that, on the S version, there's also a quick shifter, an up and down quick shifter, so you don't have to use the clutch when you're going up and you don't have to use the clutch when you're going down. The whole lot, the whole package between the electronics, the extra power, the sportier chassis and the slimmer styling, hopefully, say Ducati, gives it a feel slightly more reminiscent of that original 1993 Monster. So it's the next morning and this is the important bit. This is where we get to ride the new Monster 1200S. We're here in Monaco, which is a very swanky place, but unfortunately the sort of high population density and cramped city streets is not great for testing a 150 horsepower bike. So we're going to head up into the hills behind us here, and go for a full day's ride and see what it's like. After several hours, countless hairpins and a 3,000 foot climb, we've stopped for a bite to eat and a chance to collect our thoughts. Well, first thoughts are completely dominated by the engine on this bike. The 1198cc motor is an absolute peach. It feels immense. There is so much power at the bottom end, and as you carry on up through the revs, an already impressive amount of torque becomes just a fantastic rush of power through to the red line. The 150 horsepower engine does feel quite a lot like the 145 horsepower engine in the previous Monster S. However, there are some good things we can take from this. Firstly, the throttle, the fueling stayed just as slick as it was on the previous bike. It's a really fantastically slick, smooth delivery at the bottom end. Often when you have a big, angry V-twin, things can get quite snatchy and unpredictable. But this is really intuitive and works with you. Now, what definitely does feel different is the balance of the bike. After we had the technical presentation last night, I started digging around and asking some questions, and it turns out, as well as shortening the wheelbase, they've also made some changes to the way the bike carries its way through the front and the rear wheel. They fitted a longer shock, which has pulled the tail up and made the steering angle sharper. So the previous bike carried most of its weight through the back wheel. Now it's a much more even balance, and that's something you can really feel when you're riding. It steers into corners much more easily and more neutrally than the previous bike. It's also had the effect of raising the seat up an extra 10mm, but even in its high position, and it can be lowered by about another inch, it's still a perfect height for me and my delightfully average 5'9" frame. I can still get both feet flat on the floor. And then of course there's the electronics. Now, I might have accidentally turned off the anti-wheelie and the traction control while I was fiddling around for fuel economy information or something. But what I can tell you is the quick shifter, which works both up and down, is fantastic. It lets you change gear without needing to use the clutch, and it works on part throttle or on full throttle, at little revs, at big revs, when you're slow, when you're fast. It sounds a bit of a gimmick, it might sound a bit of a luxury that you don't really need, but honestly, not having to take your hand off the bar, onto the clutch, back onto the bar, it's just a nice little luxury to not have to do that. And once you've done it once or twice, especially steaming into and out of some of these hairpins, you start to wonder why you'd ever want to go back to a bike that doesn't have one. So that's some first thoughts of the bike. Obviously we've still got the rest of the day to go out and enjoy the pleasant weather and hopefully find some faster riding and really see what this chassis is like and see how these electronics work. After spending a morning climbing up the side of a mountain, in the afternoon our test route took us even further up into the hills, up to more than 1,000 metres above sea level, which is higher than any road in the UK. Well, the engine is clearly the star of the show. It has everything. There's loads of grunt at the bottom end, a sharp zap of power through to the top, and loads of lovely rumbly V-twin character all the way through. So the most impressive thing about the changes to the engine is not necessarily the power increase in itself, it's the fact they've managed to find more power while at the same time reducing emissions so that it now meets the new Euro 4 standards, whatever they are. And at the same time, they've managed to make it more powerful and cleaner without losing any of the Monster's manners. One other change they've made for when you're hustling it around from one side to the other is the new foot pegs. Now on the old bike, the rider's pegs and the pillion pegs were both cast in the same piece, and that meant that when you tried to ride with your toes on the pegs, you couldn't really tuck your heels in very much. For this bike, they've separated the rider and the pillion pegs, and that does give you a little bit more space to get them tucked in. It's not a total success, however. On the right-hand side, your heel now touches the exhaust, and on the left-hand side, it rubs on the swing arm. So it's better, but not quite perfect. The suspension and brakes are also worth a mention too. Obviously, both very fancy brand name Öhlins and Brembo parts, but the good thing is they feel set up for the road. The Öhlins isn't some kind of sadistic, super stiff track setup. It's firm, but well damped. It never felt harsh over any of the rough road surfaces that we were on. Meanwhile, the Brembo M50 front brakes, the same that you'd find on a Panigale, have massive amounts of power and great consistency, never faded once throughout all the downhill hairpins we were riding. They don't feel grabby when you're down in the city either. As for the new electronics, well, they make life either as easy or as exciting as you want it to be. For some of the day, I rode round with all the help turned off and the throttle cranked right up to its angriest, so that I could feel the full force of that engine exploding out the slower corners. However, later in the day, I then put it back into touring mode, which calms the throttle down, adds the traction control and some anti-wheelie, and it just makes life so simple. You don't need to think about what the bike's doing, it just drives politely forwards out of the corner. The bike comes with 3 modes, sport, touring and urban. And if it all sounds a bit complicated, it's perfectly intuitive to use. It's all controlled from some new switchgear and it's all displayed very clearly on the full colour dash. The grey S model, the bike we've been riding today, comes in at £14,632 on the road, which is quite a lot. The red version is £200 cheaper, £14,432. But if you're looking for a bit more of an economical Monster 1200, there is of course the standard non-S version. So that comes in at just £11,632. It's funny, Ducati say that they look back to the original Monster 900 when they were designing this new bike, right down to the aluminium clip holding the fuel tank on. However, with its cleaner emissions, LED daytime running lights and cutting-edge electronics, this doesn't feel like a nod to the past at all. It feels like a thoroughly modern Monster.